Welcome to week one. This is a new setup, and apparently the recording started early, I think, so we'll have to figure out what we're supposed to do about these things. We have two sections integrated. That's what makes this a little bit challenging. Every now and then there's going to be a glitch of some kind. So that being said, as you know, the attendance at this lecture and interaction with it is optional. You can watch it later if you want, but this does give you a chance to ask questions if you want to. Tonight we'll be going over just chapter 2. Now there will be some information from chapter 1 that we'll be dredging up as we go, but you'll see that as I supply it. Chapter 1 doesn't have very much information in it. It mostly tries to position organization development and change from the perspective of what the popular literature has said. Our author calls that sources. Now Burke, our author, is very intellectual. He loves the scholarly stuff, so he's going to pepper every chapter, at least after that first one, with a lot of references that, if you bothered to dig them all up, might be enlightening, but would be more exhausting than anything else. All of it's not necessary. And so the best way to wade through that kind of information is filled with citations, filled with so-and-so said this and so-and-so said that, is to try to associate whatever that reference is with the one little kernel of truth, let's say, that the author has specified. Just try to make a quick association. In most cases, we're not going to be asking, what do those little authors say? Unless I bring them up in the slide presentation, then they're going to be somewhat important, sometimes more than others. But I still think the concepts are more important. And the names that I repeat, I'll mention Cotter, I'll mention Burke, of course, the author of the textbook. I'll mention a few. I mentioned Levine, most important person, Kurt Levine, and Gestalt theory having to do with organization change. But otherwise, the concepts are more important than the theorists, in most cases. So chapter 2, and then we'll go a little beyond the textbook with some special topics and concepts, and then we'll talk a little bit about the team project. We're not going to have any individual essays in this class. Now remember, though, that means that, and I'll talk about this later, but a team project can be a challenge if you are not inclined to participate very much in a team, because we'll do peer reviews as well. People who try to sit back and just wait, you got to try to inject yourself into the team. It can be a challenge. It's good practice. Now I'm going to organize teams based on the PLSI profile, because that is the best way to do it. That may mean in some cases, this always occurs, and it always occurs anyway in real life and virtual teams. Sometimes people will be in different teams, different parts of the world. There's no way to organize people in different parts of the world such that every cluster works. The geographical clusters don't work. It's usually too many people concentrated in one place and too few people elsewhere. So it has to be the PLSI that smooths interaction as much as possible, and then beyond that, it's a matter of coordination. So without further ado, let's move into chapter 2 and see what we have, rethinking the concept of organization change. Burke takes this perspective. The first thing he tells us is this age of discontinuity. He's trying to tell you that the study of change is different now from what it used to be, because things are too fast. Things are just happening too fast now. They literally are happening faster than they used to be. It isn't an illusion. It isn't just that our generation, we always think it's faster than the previous generations. Things are moving faster. I'm going to give you an illustration. There was a time when you had to put bags of postal mail on trains and then have it transported across the country. It took a while. So that's as fast as you could communicate with anybody. So how fast did change occur? Well, something about as fast as it took to communicate long distances. Nowadays, you communicate long distances really fast. Change happens a lot faster. If the only thing that had changed were the communications faster, but the operations themselves are still just as cumbersome as ever, that'd be one thing. But operations depend so much on communication that naturally when you speed up the communication, you speed up the pace of change. Prior to the free-floating currency, people used to open the newspaper in the morning to see what the value of the dollar was against the British pound. And nowadays, you go online and see it moving. So Foster and Kaplan called this the age of discontinuity, a pace of change phenomenon. The Forbes list from 1917 to 1987, only 39 companies survived on the Forbes list. Only 18 are still in the top 100, at that time lagging the market by 20%. 1917 change was slow. Continuity was the goal. Continuity, I mean, in a business. The business would be set up so that you would just persist as much as you could, selling as much as you could, moving in the same direction. You weren't trying to change. You're trying to keep things steady, despite change, which could cause problems, but Also during that time, 1917, tariffs were really, really high. And with high tariffs, changes slope, industry by industry. Vertical integration was the dominant strategy, which means companies would buy other companies. Backward integration, forward integration, manufacturer would buy a distributor would buy a retailer, or backwards. And so the idea was get bigger and reduce your cost per unit of value obtained in the process. That's what they would all do. Standard & Poor's 500, 1957 to 1998, only 74 companies survived. Only 12 of those still outperformed the S&P index. Now, what's really going on here in part is the top 100 companies, the Standard & Poor's 500, S500 companies. These are at the top end of total productive value in the company. That means that if you look at a bell curve, it's the upper extreme, the upper tail. The upper tail of the bell curve is a very volatile area. A lot of companies wind up in there, in a sense, as a product of chance. Somebody's got to be in there. It moves a lot. Any company that can stay in the upper tail of normal distribution is an extreme exception. People try to figure out what makes these companies tick. Jim Collins believes he knows, for example, and there's something to it. But on the other hand, he said, yeah, but the upper tail is volatile anyway. If you're in the upper tail some year, the next year, you're likely not to be, just because it's so volatile. So let's move on. The paradox of planned change. Now, this is a bit of a theme that will pop up later. You're trying to change organizations, so we have this sense of a loopiness. You change something, then something, you got to go back to change this thing, and you go back over here, and you change that thing over there. The big thing that happens, though, it isn't just that changes like doing a little whack-a-mole. It's a little bit like whack-a-mole, I suppose. But it's more like this. When you have an organization, it's got lots of little processes going on all over the place. You try to change one process. Usually is what we do. Let's change that process. So we fiddle with it, and then we change it, make it do something different. Change the rules, retrain the people. Now the process is different. Will it stick? The problem with the assumption that focusing on one process is enough is that all the other processes in the organization, directly or indirectly, are affecting that process and are being affected by it. Even if you can't tell, there are assumptions associated with it. A process is a loop. It's a loop of activity. It goes around a certain sense of a circle, and then it returns to its starting point. And then after that, it keeps on going, right? So the starting point is a cue or some kind of trigger that sets off a process. We think of a process being cyclical because you end up where you started out. It's like if you go to a fast food enterprise. People are kind of behind the counter, and you wander in, you start staring at the menu. And then as soon as it's clear in front of you, somebody in front says, "May I have your order, please?" And what happened? Well, the cue was customer wandered in looking at the menu, and there was an open space. So the process starts with, "May I have your order, please?" An invitation. And that's supposed to lead to, "Yes, I want this, I want that," and then it then sends back, and this whole cyclical process happens. It's cyclical because then that same checkout person is going to be in the same spot afterwards saying, "May I have your order, please?" to the next person. So it's always cyclical. Now, every cyclical process, big, long cyclical process, little bitty short ones, all over the place, looping all over the organization. And in all kinds of ways, they affect each other. Let's say you tell the organization to stop. So one part of the organization to stop. Everything else in the organization is still going, it's still looping around, still telling that process to go, just even though you told it to stop. Everything is kicking off all of the processes all the time. Processes kicking off processes, kicking off processes. So you create this kind of perpetual motion machine. So this loopiness is a problem that we always have to deal with, in the sense that the ideal situation would be no loopiness, but then there wouldn't be an organization there. The loopiness is also what creates that organic quality in the organization. So change tends to be linear in practice because we'll say, okay, step one, we got to do this. Then we're doing this whole, trying to push the carpet down because you move the carpet here and there's a bump over there, because every process affects every other in some direct or indirect way. But we can't do it any other way. We can't change an organization, at least in a very conscious way, unless we do a step-by-step procedure. So I say right here, for example, Levine has 3 steps. That's the most generic and most generalizable model. Burke gives you 4, fundamentally the same thing as Levine, but there's some more stuff up front. And Cotter gives you 8. And Cotter's model is one thing we're going to practice in this course. The implementation is actually messy, of course. There's resistance, there's mistakes, but the biggest problem is resistance to change. That's an important concept. That's what we ask you about. Tell me about resistance to change. How does that work? The most important aspect of what makes change difficult, though, is the fact that Implementation itself is hard. You change rules, but you got to get people to practice new rules. At the very least, you change rules, maybe you move people around, you change the configuration depending on what kind of change you're doing, and then you've got to get the people used to the new system. We'll talk about that as we go, but basically you got birds in flight in a V formation. And each one is in that little spot because that's the easiest place to be. That's what we do in organizations. Individuals and organizations settle into the routine as comfortably as is possible for a routine to be. You can kind of picture yourself sitting behind a computer, and then you ask yourself, why do I sit like this? Maybe it's lean or something. At some point, you got used to doing a certain way, and now it's kind of hard for you to change it. The emergent patterns occur, chaos intervenes. Now, chaos is a tricky word. We don't want to just run around and say chaos means there's no order, because chaotic systems are not disordered systems. That's the problem, is we keep using the same word for things that we should use a different word for. But in this particular context, he's talking about chaos as disorder. Chaos intervenes, complicated stuff. So capital markets, he gets into this thing about capital markets, which is practically a deviation, but we do want to kind of touch on it. So capital markets, these are informal aggregations, buyers, sellers, financiers, competitors, interact for the purpose of economic exchange. Now think about it. In the economy, there's a group of organizations that interact a lot. So they create kind of a super organization. It's an organization of organizations. It's not a tight one. An organization has a fairly tight boundary. And organizations are special because the boundary between the organization and everything above it, and between itself and everything below it, is much firmer than at any other point. So organizations are special that way. But capital markets also have kind of a fluid boundary of their own, so they create aggregations. They are a powerful environmental force in long-term survival. Businesses can live or die from marketplace vagaries. In other words, we always have to study our capital markets, study the buyers, sellers, financiers, competitors. What does that look like in Porter's model, for those who are familiar with it? Porter's model will be, well, that's your five forces analysis. It's essentially giving you capital markets. We didn't use that term back when Porter was doing this, but it does amount to that. You're depicted in the middle with your competitive rivalry. There's a little arrow out to the right-hand side, and there's some buyers. Left-hand side, you got some your vendors or your suppliers coming in. And then two indirect influences. One is the threat of new entrants, and in the bottom part, you usually put the threat of substitutes. But all these forces affect what's going on in the economy, where the money is flowing to, where the goods are flowing to. We need to assume discontinuity rather than continuity. These capital markets weed out poor performers, they reward innovation, encourage new entrants. If that's your reference point, it's got a pretty fluid boundary. There's a lot of coming and going in that particular kind of, quote, organization. We're much more enmeshed in this this next level up than we used to be. Used to be we could just kind of hold our own and pick and choose, but we're still very stable. Now we have to interact a lot with these other forces. So capital markets, in other words, the super organization above our organization, become more important. All right, we have government agencies. These are typically heavy bureaucracies. Burke gives us the example of NASA, and NASA will come up again, of course, because we have the Challenger incident that'll pop up later. It deals with many outside entities. There's scientific community, there's watchdog groups, all kinds of pressure. There's other governmental agencies, contractors, vendors, consultants, and then we have Daniel Goldman's mantra, faster, better, cheaper. That was what he's trying to do to change NASA, faster, better, cheaper. It's a government agency, though. It's really tough to do that. Okay, the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services. Okay, that's a government agency again. You can see it's got that social orientation. Responsibility to providing our families in need, especially welfare, special needs children, plus unemployment support, training, development. Try to change an organization like that. With NASA, there's a lot more stimulus to try to show that you are cutting edge, that you are faster, that you are computerizing yourself, for example. Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, anything like it, they can get away with being a little more backward, a little more set in their ways without moving around too much. Educational organizations, notice we're moving from more vertically bureaucratic to more horizontally structured. Now we're into educational organizations. We call those networked bureaucracies. Higher education is a good example. The profit sector comes in, the University of Phoenix, expensive but convenience-oriented for-profit university, we call it, right? Raises challenges for traditional universities, once considered very traditional, safe, and enduring. That's what higher education used to be. Now we have like all of these for-profits running around out there, offering degrees with the same names as ours. And people on the outside can't tell there's any difference. There's an MBA that means something, an MBA doesn't mean anything. Depends on where you get it. And these for-profit universities, especially with the online component, can be very flexible, but we can't be, right? There's a big difference in terms of that inherent flexibility. Also, the marketing budgets are enormous. Research organizations then would get in even more network bureaucracy, more of a flat kind of structure, such that the centerpiece, the people in charge, are sort of not even in charge anymore. It's this kind of A.K. Rice Institute is your example there. There's insularity, there's trouble staying in touch with the outside world, they have dual conflicting missions, membership and education. And we'll see a little more of that later. Okay, then we get into the competitive sector, business organizations. All the organizations you can consider, government agencies, public sector, the volunteer sector, churches, religious organizations. Business organizations are the ones that have to stand on their own the most. They're most truly organic in their nature. By organic, I don't mean loose, because the networked organizations are already loose. Business organizations have to be very adaptive to changes in the environment. Otherwise, they're allowed to die. Where bureaucracies and some of these others have institutional protections very often outside of themselves that keep them from dying. The business organizations are having to look out for their own survival. So we say change is the only constant. I remember hearing that back in the 90s. Change is the only constant. It was almost like just a slogan. And nowadays it's sort of real. I was actually quite surprised. When I first came to Troy University just 2 decades ago, I was surprised how constantly it would change. The business school, was constantly changing as far as I was concerned, because I'd been to other business schools before and they just stayed the same. All of a sudden I'm in one where they're constantly reviewing and updating and overhauling things and saying, okay, let's try this now. And it was remarkable, but that's actually normal nowadays, to be in an organization of that kind. The rate of change itself is increasing, and it's intensifying adaptability demands on organizations, steepening our learning curves. We actually have to become people who are constantly just open to learning a new way. We never quite get comfortable in our niche. We got to get up and start all over again. The external environment, change process begins with the environment, ends with it, of course. That we need to keep that in mind. But in modern times, we are more open. Let's pretend there's a boundary there. It's more porous than it used to be on average. It used to be you could have a pretty rigid boundary and get away with it for a while. Nowadays, it's a bit more of a porous boundary, so you have to learn to adapt. All right, so metaphors of choice. Now, here's where Burke says, here, I'm trying to get to this point where I tell you I like this Capra guy, because Capra he's talking about an organic way of looking at an organization. So he goes through this process. What's an organization? Is it a brain, a psychic prison, an organism? He gives you these weird examples. The organism is the most common metaphor. Now, if we say metaphor, we're saying we don't really mean organizations is an organism. We mean it's so much like it that we can treat it like that in conversation for a while and get away with it. So if it's actually a metaphor and it is not an objective description, for example, a scientific description, then we have to keep that in mind. The organization's brains are over here and its arms are over there. It's a metaphor. But there's a lot of truth in it, in the sense that when we say, well, an organization is an open system, a complex system, a chaotic system, we're saying the same thing, but now in a scientific way, and it's no longer a metaphor. So if we say it's an organism, or open system, complex system, chaotic system, we say that we're trying to emphasize its dependence on the environment more than by saying an organization is a machine of some kind. Organizations are open systems by definition. They're open, flexible, adaptable, so this metaphor is attractive. And the strength of this metaphor is its emphasis on survival. Obviously, that's most important for business organizations. The organism's fundamental nature is concrete. It's a concrete thing, right? An organism. There's a bug out there someplace. Got a little arm and a little legs. There's a cell. These are organisms. They're very concrete. You know they're there. They're not there. They're not floating around invisible. I guess some of them are invisible. I don't know. But the limitation, therefore, of the organismic metaphor is that we're made to assume materiality when we look at an organization. So, okay, well, be careful with it. We can see it, we can touch it. So the reality is an organization is a social construction. It's a product of somebody's ideas, visions, and beliefs, real in its effects and self-perpetuating. Now, a social construction actually refers to this. A bunch of people all are acting as though a certain thing is real, and so their actions reinforce that reality. Fundamentally, a social construction is a shared belief in something, a shared conception of something. If you believe that something is true, and then you act as though it's true, and at the same time your actions actually influence the perception of truth. For example, if you believe the economy is real, then you trade, then you're part of the economy, you help the economy be the economy, well then it happens. But it's also an objective reality. It isn't just a social construction. I've interacted with sociologists often enough to whom social construction fundamentally is, they try to emphasize it's all in your mind, it's all in your mind, as though systems theory is just something in your head. When you see the movement, though, whatever makes the movement occur, whatever makes the interaction in an organization occur, everybody believes it's there, so everybody interacts as though it's there. Okay, fine. But out in nature, we also have open systems, and they act as though it's true too, and they're not thinking it. So the human mechanism for open systems, the human mechanism for complex systems or self-organizing principles is the mind, and how the mind will do certain things. What does the mind do in order to effectuate this? We adopt mental models. We join an organization and we become a part of it, we socialize into it, and in so doing we adopt a mental model we call organizational culture. There are some artifacts of organizational culture that we kind of get into, like the language and the jargon, a certain behavior, but organizational culture is fundamentally assumptions, and there's values that you actually talk about, and there's stuff that you do and see. Well, what drives that is the mental model. The part of your thinking is, when I'm here, I have this picture of how to be. There it is, mental model. It's not your whole brain. It's just there are certain. You might say there's a bunch of information in your brain, and everybody shares that information. It's amazing how culture works. So we say another limitation of the organismic metaphor is its functional unity. Organisms have interdependent parts, and so each element supports other elements, and that's going too far when you say organizations are like that. Organizations thrive on creativity, conflict, and debate, not like an organism. So we obviously need to keep this in mind. There's old Capra down there in his book, The Web of Life, New Scientific Understanding of Living Systems. Now back in the 90s, there were several books actually on this, take a new view of the universe sort of thing. Remember it had Margaret Wheatley in 1992, Leadership in the New Sciences. It wasn't groundbreaking, it was just, she happened to put a cool book together, a whole bunch of neat pictures in it, and described all the new sciences and how it makes you think new ways about organizations. So it was a thing in the 90s, and Burke really found it interesting. Also, systems theory became really popular in the 90s among people in research, so you can see a little bit of conflation in there. But systems theory, despite the fact that people eventually had a little trouble with it and started kind of discarding it. The fact is, it's a valid way of looking at organizations. It's just a challenging way. Whatever you call it, systems theory, open system theory, which is not really a good way to call it, complexity theory, chaos theory. You can approach the science of organizations using the words associated with each of these little areas of thought. From a systems perspective, we might say equifinality, and we might say dynamic homeostasis. From a complexity perspective, the words are a little different because the literature is a little bit different, but they're saying the same thing using different words. So we'll say resilience instead of equifinality, and we'll say homeostasis instead of dynamic homeostasis, things like this. We'll say dissipative structures instead of negative entropy, I guess the equivalent term is in systems theory. So we have this biological origin of systems theory, but the fact is that by 1950 it was generalized to all self-organizing systems, which is very important. And in complexity theory, of course, that comes out of chemistry and injects new terminology, as I said, into that same paradigm. Chaos theory, another angle, new terminology in the same paradigm. Fractality is an essential subcomponent of chaos theory. Understanding fractality means you understand how an organization functions. It gives you a little more insight into how changing something in an organization, let's say at one level, will change lower levels in certain ways, but you can't go backwards. Anyway, so there's Capra's work. Let me move on to levels of analysis. So quickly through the levels of analysis, there are three main levels of analysis to help us keep track of what we're saying when we're talking about organizations. Are we talking at the organization level of analysis? So we say stuff like organizational culture. Well, that's something that exists at the organization level of analysis. If you understand the principle of emergence, that at a particular level of analysis, certain characteristics emerge that they're not there at the lower levels of analysis. And we say, okay, what exists at the organization level of analysis that's not quite there at lower levels of analysis? We say organizational culture as an example. The group level of analysis, we can say team norms, but we can't say team culture. I've seen team culture written in at least one book. It's a misnomer. Because the team doesn't have a culture. The team's culture is a derivative of what's going on in the organization. That's the culture of the team. But it does have norms. Norms are peculiar to the team. They're part of what the team experiences. They can be driven somewhat consciously by team members to the extent that they try to drive team norms. Culture is different. Culture is more pervasive, and so it occupies a higher level of analysis. Then you get to the individual level of analysis, and then what do you have? Well, you call it personality. Motivation, for example. Motivation is at the individual level of analysis. Personality, anything psychological is the individual level analysis. Social psychology is always the answer to the question of how does the individual interact with other people, but it still describes it from the perspective of a single individual. Social psychology, therefore, is our science of understanding group behavior. Yeah, so you notice we have the total system level of analysis: mission, strategy, structure, culture. You have sometimes a word will be the same as at the team level. The word structure, for example, such a thing as team structure, but what it means is different from what structure means at the organizational level of analysis. So we need to keep levels of analysis very clear in our minds and exercise that kind of thinking when we're into organization development and change. And quickly, types of organization change. These are very basic phenomena that we'll see later. There's revolutionary versus evolutionary. Revolutionary, of course, sudden, big, discontinuous. You change something big. And later on, we'll get a little bit more specific. And how can you tell the difference between revolutionary and evolutionary? Evolutionary, gradual, continuous. Normally, how we look at it, though, is evolutionary change is the same thing as incremental change. I would say it's not literally. If you take a complexity perspective, you're going to see some differences in how you understand that. But fundamentally, evolutionary means you're nipping around the edges. You're basically all process improvement. You take a process and you apply quality management techniques to it to improve it. Fundamentally amounts to evolutionary types of change. But there are other contrasts. We have episodic versus ongoing types of change. Transformational change, that would be the same thing as revolutionary, just another perspective on it. Transactional change, we'll see that later in the text. This distinction, in fact, transactional change is the province of management. Transformational change is the province of leadership. So already we're seeing we need to distinguish management from leadership in terms of roles. Most of the time, a manager and a leader are the same person, but the roles are different. So we need to keep that in mind. Strategic versus operational, of course. Strategic is comprehensive, total system change versus perhaps local. So these kinds of contrasts. Here's evolutionary change, continuous change. You got the little monkey people over here on the right. The last guy's got a cell phone, apparently. Continuous change. We decide to change how we're designing a product. We decide to change how we're going to deliver a service. Decide to measure and improve quality. That would all be considered continuous change. Maybe workable through limited segments of staff. You may phase the involvement of organization members over time. Always be wary, though. Evolutionary change, or let's say changing the design of a product, you still need to try to, even if it's, in other words, this is very localized, you need to bring everybody else into it in some sense, at least awareness. We're doing this in the marketing department, everybody. Here's what it looks like. We wanted to give you a little overview, right? You tell everybody. They've got to know that because they have to know what to expect as well, right? There are various loops going on over here, big loops, little loops, and they're all affecting these loops. If you just change what's going on in the marketing department and nobody else gets to know, you're going to have weird pressures, mostly coming in at the marketing department, kind of trying to force it back into its old shape, even with something like this. So you always try to pin down all those other parts of the organization just to make sure that the thing can stick. And when evolutionary change occurs on purpose, we call it Kaizen, because that means, it literally means change good. So it means improvement, but we treat it as a technical term now. Revolutionary change, basic strategy changes, let's say. When Target needed to go from a cost leader to essentially what amounts to a multi-focused firm, using Porter's terminology. That was an enormous strategic change, and it turned out to work really well. That kind of approach is very dangerous, though. It doesn't always work. Changing the strategy. But one thing you want to do with changing strategy, well, the question, how do you change strategy? Well, let's say go Porter's model with the core strategies. You have cost leaders and differentiators. Everybody knows those are the opposites. Then there are these focused firms. But you can't go straight from cost leader to differentiator or vice versa without seriously risking destroying yourself. But you can go from one of those, and if you can try hard enough and you have enough of a budget, especially if you're big because it's going to cost you a lot of money, you can scoot through the focused firm action and very carefully, if you really have to, keep on going to the other side. I haven't seen an organization do that yet, but you can move into the focused firm at least, get away with it. So major shifts in the external environment force organization to change in fundamental ways. Strategy, mission, culture, raison d'etre, cultural change. Every time you do a merger, you gotta, okay, our culture is this, their culture is that. We gotta work on culture big time. Don't just assume that, I mean, we've heard this a lot. Don't just assume that the acquired organization's culture is gonna kind of change. People pretend culture doesn't exist. Does culture need change? It's the emotional factor, change monster, even forces that prevent change. You find organizations breaking apart after their merger, like Daimler Chrysler, for example, because eventually it's that they didn't ever try to merge the cultures. They just assumed that everybody would adapt by themselves. Culture is its own big animal. We have content versus process. Content, of course, is what, process is how. When I think of a process, though, I think of it in very systems kinds of terms. I describe a process as, first this happens, okay, there's a trigger. Maybe it's the time on the wall. At 5 o'clock, everybody does this. Or maybe it's when somebody asks this question. Maybe somebody submits a request. A trigger occurs. Or maybe an accident happens. A trigger occurs. And the process starts. First you do this, then you do that, then if this, then that, then that, then this, right? And you can describe a process as in kind of a line and box chart with little triangles and things all through. In other words, a flow chart to clarify. That's what a process looks like. But a true process, of course, closes back in on itself and ends where it started. We don't normally do flow charts like that. And if you draw a line back to the starting point, it's kind of academic, but still, that process is always restart in the same position in which they started. Well, here we have the process of what an organization change initiative will look like. Notice we have here what's listed here is plan, launch, implement, and sustain the change. Those are actually Burke's 4 phases of change implementation. Notice it step by step. You describe the first one, there's a trigger, you can describe what goes on in the first phase, called planning, describe what goes on in the launch, describe implementation, and so forth. And of course, every change initiative, you can only describe generally what should occur in all possible change initiatives. Otherwise, for each one, you have to adapt it. In this particular change initiative, the planning is going to involve this, this, and this, instead of that, that, and that. Launch is going to look like this. And the content then is what exactly is changing. Back up to the content. You may change your purpose, your mission, your strategy, your values, your identity. Obviously, those are really big. And then we get these organizational models. Burke believes is very important, and it does make sense to me as well. Stay consistent with your theoretical model. Don't just bounce around. Now, that doesn't quite mean the same thing as your paradigm. I mean, if your paradigm is that of self-organizing complexity, you can use terminology from systems theory, complexity theory, chaos theory, fractality, and mix it because it's the same paradigm, really. It's not different paradigms. But organization theory is a different paradigm from systems theory. Organization theory, actually, the people who study in that area refer to like about half a dozen different so-called paradigms. For example, let's say the population ecology paradigm. It's one way of looking at how organizations as a whole interact with each other and how some of them survive and some of them don't, right? There's agency theory. And each one of these types of reasoning within organization theory, within that science, has its own way of, its own logic to follow. So you want to be clear on whether if you're into self-organizing complexity, then you stick with that. But I would say it's more important to stick with the proper level of analysis when you're discussing something, because if you're bouncing in levels of analysis, you get a lot of confusion. But if you're confusing, let's say, the mechanistic paradigm with the self-organizing paradigm, yes, that's going to cause a lot of trouble. Put it this way, the mechanistic paradigm doesn't belong in discussions of proper organization development and change. You know, the one where you treat the organization like a giant machine. You can't use machine metaphors in treating an organization. That'd be like the same thing as pretending a car is a living being and treating it that way. Oh, it's hungry, it needs more hay. It's like, well, that would be the same thing. The proper way to look at an organization is through the paradigm of self-organizing complexity, or systems theory, is another way to say it. The Burke-Litwin model we're going to see later in the text. Burke, of course, really excited about this because it's his model. But actually, it's a very good model. It's one of those, it looks like it's a little overwhelming, but it does a good job distinguishing certain important factors. I've seen lots of these big, giant models, and I thought they just go too far. But this was actually pretty good. All right, then we have a few more issues to deal with. Metrics and plan change. We have measurable change based on data. What we try to do is we want to get at measuring change. And if you saw the Hossenfelder video, Sabine Hossenfelder, she's a really good science podcaster. She's actually telling you all about what complex systems really mean by exploring, well, how on earth do we measure complexity? So we get at this metrics issue. She says it's pre-scientific unless we can measure it. This can be dangerous, let's say, if you're surrounded by a bunch of sociologists who don't believe in metrics. They're always like that. They don't believe in measuring anything. Anthropologists are the worst. They're a subset of sociologists. If you can't measure what you're looking at, then you can't tell if it's changed in the right direction or not, or if it's changed at all, perhaps. So we take measures over time. Whatever the measure is, we say, okay, how can we figure out what it's doing right now? Well, let's see. Well, here's a process. Okay, how can you tell if it gets it wrong? How can you tell if the output's wrong? Well, then it will look like this, or it'll fall short in this way. All right, can we count up how many times it comes out wrong? Right, you're talking about a process maybe they haven't measured yet, and you want to improve it. You believe it's not doing what it's supposed to do, so there must be some way that you can tell. You look at it, haircut process. How can you tell if it's wrong? I don't know. Everybody says it looks fine. Well, maybe ask more specific questions. What about when the guy says, okay, how's it look? And he says, can you do a little more of this? Maybe that's a negative. Maybe that's a ding. Maybe you write that down. Maybe somebody says, okay, I'll put a little tick mark on, that was a ding. I don't know. Figure out a way to do it. With services, it can be quite a challenge. But the point is, you want to improve the process, you have to figure out how you can tell how effective it is right now. There's got to be a number in there somewhere, something that says this is good, that's bad. And looking for error rates is often a good place to start. I get that from quality management, science of quality management. Decreasing error is essentially what you do every time you improve a process. And so that should be the first thing you think of, just decrease error. You improve productivity by decreasing the errors that come out of the process. All right, so take measures over time. And then we have various kinds of leadership. This is a little bit repetitious, but transformational change, transformational leadership, of course, is that charismatic, big, over the top. I'm the head honcho, and we're going to change in this way. Everybody gets excited, right? It's overwhelming. But then transformational change is the corresponding phenomenon that occurs in terms of what an organization goes through. So the transformational leader, transformational change. One kind of moves into the other. And this transformational versus transactional leadership, of course, which comes from Bass and Burns, for those of you who've taken the leadership courses, Burke quickly glommed on that and said, the same thing, there's the same distinction in organizations. That's why he said, transformational change in organizations, the big change, the mission, the culture, the strategy, that's the province of leadership, per se. Leadership, that thing, whatever that means in an organization, that's what transformational is. Transactional change is more incremental. That's management's job. That's very interesting. Kind of makes you think about that. When management engages in transformational change, management is being leadership. So change leaders, pre-launch, launch, implementation, sustainment. Again, that's Burke's 4 phases. We'll see those again later. And personality helps, charisma unnecessary. We say that because transformational leadership is the same thing as charismatic leadership, but we're saying the change does not require that style. It's just a nature of change that corresponds to that style of leadership. And then last but not least, we have a complexity plan change. Where traditional literature is helpful but limited. Organization theory, behavior development, strategic management. The history of management thought fundamentally is about organization change. And you say the most complex form of management thought today is probably still that. The one you feel like you haven't quite figured it out yet. Even though we figured out ways to do it, there's so much iffiness to the process, so much risk involved in the process. And maybe because most people just take it too lightly, they don't try to pull the whole thing into their minds at the same time. Life sciences are helpful to give you helpful insights for application. The science of organizing complexity, I give you those three main vernaculars there: systems theory, complexity theory, chaos theory. Then we have this interesting reference here, The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. That's for a former journalist. He's actually pretty smart. You read his books and he knows what he's talking about. It's interesting how he will use very concrete examples of essentially what amounts to statistical representations of certain kinds of social phenomena. Selecting young people for the youth football team, it turns out that when you select them, you look at their birth dates, because they can only qualify at a certain age. When you select them, they all seem to be near the next birthday, or most of them are near the next birthday. Why is that? Well, because they're older and bigger now. So simple and so obvious when you think about it. You think that, well, you're picking the best, when all you're doing is picking the oldest. A lot of that goes on out there. All right, well, that's enough to be talking about for the moment. So let's take a little break, and then we'll go into some special topics, mainly having to do with systems theory plus one on goal orientation theory. And so time for a breather. Let's move to special topics and concepts. So the first item is on systems theory, and these have to do with the videos. There are only 3 videos that I have posted aside from the lecture, because Hossenfelder covers 3 topics pretty interestingly. But first, Lyon gives you a description of positive and negative feedback, describable as loops of recurring cycles of events. So he's describing systems theory and then emphasizing these feedback loops, which I think is very important. So I asked, how does this dynamic explain an organization's value-adding processes? Well, here's where I go with this. It's positive and negative feedback, a very important concept to consider, but it's sometimes you're looking for, is that positive or negative, and wondering. So it's a good mental exercise at the same time. So positive feedback magnifies disequilibrium. Just take an organization and say, all right, what happens in an organization that creates an effect that pulls the organization or maybe part of it further away from equilibrium? So whenever you produce a product, all of a sudden, whoop, you got a product. It's like, now you got to put it someplace. You've gone far from equilibrium. How about a whole bunch of products? You got a whole bunch of products in a big old warehouse. Here's a simple example of an organization back in the old days, back in the prior to 1920 or in the 20s. Organizations used to produce, let's say, your Sherwin paints or DuPont. Right? You produce a bunch of paint. The whole idea was you produce as much as paint as possible, and you have this big old warehouse and you're storing it, and all you're trying to do is sell it. And so you have a kind of a separate set of processes. You're producing a bunch of paint, you're shoving it all into warehouses, and then some other folks are selling it in your organization, maybe. And you don't think in terms of, there's no just in time, there's no demand pull, anything like that. You just stack up a whole bunch of paint and sell it. So, well, if you get too much paint, then what do? Well, now you have to maybe get more warehouse space to make up for the difference. But you can see you're pulling away from equilibrium. Now, you could argue that the extension of warehouse space is trying to compensate for the paint. That's true. But in a sense, what you're doing is simply moving with the positive feedback and not resolving it. You're just creating a larger version of yourself, which is what we do when we eat too much, by the way. Same thing. It's far from equilibrium. And so the organization then has to get people to buy this stuff. What we need is to convert all that into energy. But in an organization, energy is money. So money. So a bunch of Sherwin paint goes out the door and a bunch of money comes back in. So okay, now the money can be used to energize the organization. So that's essentially how it works. So negative feedback has the opposite effect, attenuates disequilibrium, it squashes them a little bit. So every time you break something down, every time you pull something back, you're applying negative feedback. And if it's process, it's negative feedback loop is doing this. So negative feedback dominates early and late processes in the value-adding system. The value-adding portion, you could argue, is not even the earliest and latest portion of it. It depends on what you mean by that. But the true value-adding is an anabolic process. You're building up something. But what happens, at least in theory, when you get a bunch of supplies for your organization, you have to break them down. Well, not a lot of days. Most of the time, we get stuff from our suppliers, and all we have to do is get it open from the boxes and stuff, and that's as much breaking down as we need to do. But in theory, bringing in raw materials, you got to do something to it to make them ready to put into the value-adding process. So that's all negative feedback right at the shipping dock, right? You're just doing something to decrease the difference between the received goods natural state and the state that they need to be in order to work on it. So all that work that's being done is all negative feedback. All right, you open up all the boxes, everything's ready. Now all of a sudden you put everything in place, and now it's positive feedback. Everything is added value. For the longest time, most of the system within the organization, you're adding value, you're building this, building that, build. To a point where you could argue that it's difficult to do a lot of times, but most of the time, but you can say, well, let's try to figure out how much value added this one process contributed. Ultimately, you should be able to do that, but it's pretty tricky if you've never done it before. Trying to reduce the total value added down to the process level. This process, yeah, but I have this part and it feeds over there and everything. Yeah, but there's a way to do it. Ultimately, it's probably important anyway, because every time you hire somebody, you have to do so with the intent that individual is going to give you, after you've given the individual the right tools and stuff, a lot more value than you give back, or just more value than you give back. And the individual should, at the same time, be capable through your tools and through your setup of producing a lot more value in your organization than that individual could produce outside. So it's win-win if you do it right. It's a challenge for HR. Anyway, so we say then late in the value-adding system, the tail end of it, now you'd have a product, and in order to restore equilibrium, you have to sell it and exchange it for money. Sell it and exchange it for energy, matter of speaking. And then you've restored it. That's a negative feedback, but everything in the middle is positive. So positive feedback dominates the center. then I say in early processing, negative feedback is catabolic in nature, means break down in nature to render inputs usable. Anabolic processes then take over. At the end of the processing, the system releases value-added output to the environment as the final instance of negative feedback. Now, here's something that people hardly ever think about. What about the people that you hire? When you acquire them, do you break them down? What are you doing? Well, yeah, you do break them down. Not the way it sounds. You don't have a meat tenderizer. There's none of that going on. The fact is that people come in, you have to socialize them. So you're training them, you're orienting them, you're training them, you're giving the right verbiage, whatever. All this stuff that you're doing to get the individuals ready, because some of you call positive, some call negative, but the negative feedback is fundamentally the catabolic aspect of the intake operation. The individuals come in first, I'm untrained, I don't know what I'm doing, I can't do anything, and I don't have the right culture. Okay, we need to break down those differences between what you are naturally and what we need you to be to work for us. We need to break down those differences. So you say, well, a lot of the training, the orientation is breakdown in nature. It's to get you used to being a certain way for the organization. And other parts of the training or the socialization process is cultural in nature. Give it about 4 months, and now you are a part of the organization. The breakdown has occurred. But with a human being, of course, that's how we operate. When we leave the organization, we haven't lost anything. When we go into the organization, all of a sudden we adapt immediately to the environment because we've broken down that distance, that difference between us and what the organization needs. It's a deep concept, but that would all be catabolic in nature. And you say, well, what about anabolic on the matter of human resource management? So anabolic would include all training to improve skills after that. Makes sense. We got complexity theory. Here's Hossenfelder. She's funny, by the way, so you've got to listen to her. Consider Dr. Hossenfelder's description of complexity theory. How does your emphasis on defining complexity as the middle ground between order and disorder inform our conception of the model organization? This is really interesting because I've seen lots of descriptions of complexity theory, and I've only seen her do have this particular take on it, and it makes perfect sense. It's exactly right. It's a middle ground. So if you think about it, complexity is, in the scientific sense, the distance from both disorder and order, or absolute disorder and absolute order. It's the distance. So you could argue, well, I don't know, I mean, you get too close to absolute order, then it's less complex, I guess. Is it exactly in the middle? I don't know what that curve looks like, but clearly it's in there somewhere. There's a point of maximum complexity. Why is that important? Because then she gets into emergence and evolution. It says the point of maximum complexity is a point also of maximum potential emergence of new properties out of the substrate, and then evolution itself. Organizations need to evolve. When we say evolve, I mean they're constantly adapting to the environment. Whatever the environment is throwing at them, they're kind of moving around. But they can only do that if they are complex enough. An organization that's too rigid, a little too close to too much order, has trouble adapting. In fact, that's always been our problem. As people running organizations, we've always had a problem with, here's an organization, starts as an entrepreneur, it grows, it gets really successful and everything, and then it always runs the risk of becoming too rigid. It doesn't usually run the risk of becoming too dissolute and start falling apart. It could do that, but it normally is the other way around. And I think it's interesting because the first time that anyone discovered the self-organizing, the anabolic processes going on in organizations, that was Bertalanffy, who came up with systems theory originally. He called that process, he's like, well, negative entropy. So if you move in the opposite direction from entropy, if that's all you see, oh look, you're moving opposite from entropy. Now you're looking at a complex system, so it's in the realm of complexity. It's complex enough already, right? But you see it moving the opposite direction from entropy. You say, well, if you move fast enough, you'll get really rigidified eventually, won't you? You'll build up so much, pretty soon you're just too heavy, and you can't move. Interesting. So we don't call it moving towards entropy, though. So you notice with terms like edge of chaos, with the change is the only constant. But these kinds of references, direct and indirect references to chaos theory, we're essentially acknowledging that throughout modern history of organizations, we've been tending towards too much structure and messing ourselves up in the process. The bigger we get, the more structured we become, and then we can't adapt anymore. So we all have to learn, especially when we're large, we have to learn to back up and try to get a little less organized, a little less heavily structured, more agile, without falling apart. Edge of chaos, that's tricky. And if you happen to move a little bit too close, if you loosen up too much, you start moving towards that cliff where all of a sudden you fall into chaos. I say the edge of chaos. We're talking, when we say chaos theory is a type of self-organizing complexity, vernacular, we're saying that we're closer to that point of dropping off into chaos, but we're still organized, and things become more lively at that point. Anyway, so I say organizations are self-organizing structures, and we have to understand that as just a fundamental fact of life. Therefore, they occupy a position on a continuum between pervasive disorder, which we call high entropy, and rigid order, which is low entropy, that optimizes the balance between anabolic or order building and catabolic or order destroying forces. When I say catabolic, we're talking about inputs being the catabolic process of breaking them down. So order destroy, well, we're destroying the difference between the input and what we need. So order destroying is a funny way to put it, I suppose, in this sense. A constant change is the natural state of any entity in this position. When you're far from both extremes, change is happening all the time. This capacity for ongoing change is necessary for the organization to adapt to environmental disruptions without losing integrity. You're going to become more adaptive. Become too adaptive, too open to the environment, just throw yourself open to the whole environment, and then you fall apart, you lose your integrity. The integrity, and I say the organizational boundary is the most resilient of all the boundaries you have, of all the levels of analysis, from individuals and groups within the organization to everything going on above the organization. The organizational boundary is the most self-identifying level that you hit. That has the most integrity. The capital market, or capital aggregation of entities around you with which you interact that constitute kind of a quasi-superstructure above your organization, that's got a really fluid boundary. It doesn't have a lot of integrity. That's why it changes a lot by comparison. Yeah, so that's pretty heady stuff. I like your example of the coffee. You have coffee, it starts out looking like something dark, pour some milk into it. At first there's all this stuff going on. Well, you describe that as increasing complexity. Then the complexity decreases as the whole thing turns into one solid new color. In between was where the complexity was. Even though it's a very rapid process and it's very simple and physical, it does represent it very well. So chaos theory then. She does get into chaos theory, and I thought this is a very nice, clear distinction. How does this conception offer a contrast from complexity theory? The distinguishing characteristic of a chaotic system, and he has trouble with the word. D. Hock used the term chaotic to try to solve that problem, and a lot of people use that nowadays. So the chaotic system is that small changes in inputs, construed as initial conditions usually when we're describing these things, produce dramatic differences in the emergent structure of an unpredictable nature. When we think of complex systems, we think nonlinearity is in there. That's characteristic, nonlinear. An input occurs, and then there's a magnitude of difference by the time it turns into an output. When you look at the value chain, how it starts out low levels of value to build, become high levels of value. So, well, yeah, I can see that. Value adding, in other words, all those positive feedback loops, naturally magnify the input into something very impactful. Now, in complexity theory, we tend to think in terms of inputs and outputs and the nonlinear relationship between them. The growing. The attenuating doesn't normally happen, but that would be negative feedback if it does. So positive feedback loops, we have magnification going on from input to output. Negative feedback loops, we have attenuation going on, but usually that's in various parts of the organization, not from the beginning to the end. And then in chaos theory, we tend to think instead of inputs and outputs, which we could, because that's where it really starts, if you read Edward Lawrence. It started literally with inputs. But they referred to them as initial conditions instead. Because with Lawrence, he was like, you say, hey, let's take the data, stick it back in the machine again, see what happens. And all of a sudden it was wildly different because of teeny tiny differences in the input variables. But it means otherwise the same thing. So when you think of initial conditions or the elemental structure of an organization, chaos theory likes to think in those terms. So you're kind of thinking of things at the bottom, sitting there at the floor, little interactive parts. and in a certain configuration, this system emerges. It looks like whatever. And then little differences in there, all of a sudden it just vastly changes. That's what it feels like when they're describing chaos theory. But basically, we're talking about the difference between a complex system, strictly computed. There's a nonlinear impact on the inputs. The inputs become really, really big outputs. In complexity theory, we can predict what those are. We have control over those. In chaos theory, we can't. It's gone too far. Now they're wild. Sometimes chaos theory influences us in this way. We think in terms of, let's make these changes in this organization and see what happens. And be on the lookout for strange things to crop up and see if those are valuable, useful, see if we can harness those things. So now you're pushing the organization towards a loose enough adaptive condition so that you may see things crop up that you don't expect. And then it's simply a case of trying to track them. Or complexity theory is like, well, yeah, complex system. Yeah, we make stuff all the time. Inputs, outputs, look, all kinds of value, everything's great. A complex system, everything is predictable. You've seen it before. That's the difference. So I say unpredictable nature. By comparison, although complex systems are similar on the matter of nonlinear dynamics, the input-output effects fall within the constraints of predictability. So we usually talk about management. That's managerial. Now, if I threw this at Burke and said, hey, Burke, look, chaos theory versus complexity theory, what do you think in terms of nonlinear dynamics? He'd say, actually, it makes a lot of sense. So it's a complex system. If we're talking about transactional change, he would probably say something like that. But now you're allowing the system, or you're pulling the system into more of a chaotic condition in order to invite more unpredictable change, more transformational change. You can put it that way. Say, well, what does that tell us about big kinds of changes like strategic changes? It tells you that they're dangerous because you're not really sure if it's going to work. The more uncertain you become, the inputs to the outputs, the riskier every kind of change is, which is legitimate. And that's probably where that all lands, really. Then we get emergence. Emergence is a very important concept, and of course Hoskenfelder mentioned that too. So I say on the continuum between rigid order and free entropy, one encounters an optimum at which emergence becomes the defining feature. So when we say complexity is how far you are from both order and disorder, both extreme order and extreme disorder. Well, what happens there when you're in that spot? What changes happen all the time? What else is happening? Emergence is happening all the time when you're at that optimum point. Beyond this point, where entropy is stronger, emergence gives way to a complete unraveling of the system. So what direction are you going in? Right now, you're optimal. You have emerging structures. The organization grows, it becomes a new thing. Hurricanes look like jelly donuts from space, right? That's the emergent structure. Now, they're chaotic systems, highly volatile, and so you have to go from the elements, which are tiny, and then, heat and stuff and water, to suddenly the whole thing. There's not like gradations in there, like you see little internal boundaries in a hurricane, because it's chaotic. It's like a tornado. It's like the elements are tiny, the thing is big. The structure is emergent. It looks like a jelly donut. Tornadoes look like tornadoes. But organizations have, because they're not quite as chaotic, they're more complex, they have gradations within them. So you go from, let's say, the individual socio-technical system, I guess you could call it. A person is a person, but then in the organization, a person is essentially a role being played out. And the individual who's there is not really the component of the organization. It's that individual's movement and thought processes, interacting with the tools. That's the individual level of analysis right there. All right, well, the emergent property of that individual level socio-technical system then is work being done at an individual level. Okay, then you move up from there and you get a group or a team. Could be a group of people doing the same thing, so it's not really a team. Could be a group that really interacts a lot, so it is a team. Anyway, you hit another emergent level, and all of a sudden you have new properties that don't exist at the lower level, so emergence is happening. Then another level of emergence happens. Maybe there's a department, then maybe another one there's a division, maybe another one's a whole organization. You can have several levels before you get to the outer organization. Well, where emergence is happening the most, well, that's where complexity is at an optimum. It's the best place you want to be, where emergence is allowed to happen. You ever see organizations, like somebody like Al Dunlap used to come in back in the day. He was one of these turnaround artists, but he'd come and tear up a company. He'd fire most of the executive team. He would sell off big, giant chunks of the organization, get some financiers to help with the finances, and then sharpen up a much smaller but more energetic company, clean it up a lot, clean up the brand. He's retrenching. Basically the solution to a company in serious trouble is you retrench. Now you save the company that way. You save some jobs as opposed to letting all the jobs just go through bankruptcy. And so you save a chunk in there. You save the value. In fact, you create future jobs because now it can grow again. Well, that retrenchment, that is a movement away from this optimum towards, you could argue, more rigid structure as opposed to a more flexible structure. But that rigid structure is supposed to be the basis of then now inching back towards a more flexible structure whenever you do a retrenchment like this. But notice then, if you're too open to the external environment, and next week we'll take a little close look at a guy named Lin who wrote an interesting piece on bridging versus buffering. You see that some organizations try to be much more open to the environment, but it becomes dangerous. You're more open to the environment, you're moving towards entropy, you're not moving towards more structure. And if you go too far towards entropy, you're getting really close to chaos, which can be good for up to a point, and then it can get really, really, really risky. And that's usually what we're encouraged to do. In general, we're encouraged to go more towards entropy, more towards the chaos point than we ordinarily would. Why is that? Because you look around and most people tend inadvertently towards more structure. So we know that the tendency for everybody, the natural tendency is to fall into structure as opposed to trying to inject the energy into everything that you're doing so that you can move away from it and then have greater chance of new emergent structures to occur. So evolution is possible where emergence occurs. And when we talk about organizational evolution, we mean organizational adaptiveness to environmental disruptions. You want to get to a point where the organization itself is pretty much structured so that when things happen in the environment, the organization starts kind of moving around by itself, as opposed to the environment keeps changing, the organization is stuck that way for a while, and pretty soon it gets worse and worse and worse. The disequilibrium between the organization and the external environment becomes impossible. And all of a sudden you come in with take a sledgehammer to the place trying to change it all that way. You'd rather there be natural changes occurring within the organization through all kinds of sources, all the employees in there having something to do with, they understand what's going on, they move this way, they move that way, to the extent that you possibly can. There are structured ways to do it, like in the HR system, for example, and then there are cultural ways to do it. Okay, last but not least, we move away from these heady issues of systems theory and stuff, which we'll be touching on as we go. And we're going to touch on goal orientation theory, in part because this perspective is closely related to what Burke will get into later when we get into the Burke-Litwin model, because it has to do with a source of climate. So this is just a basic idea here. First, we have this thing out there, and those of you who have studied leadership will probably remember McClelland, or actually, if you took the organizational behavior course, you might remember McClelland. McClelland gave us need for power, need for achievement, need for affiliation. It's a much more important model than it seems like it is. In that model, McClelland's model, need for achievement is essentially what you get when you see a true-to-life entrepreneur, not a huckster, but I mean somebody who's really out there always building new stuff and just can't help but do that. That's a high need for achievement person, solving problems all the time, building new things. The need for affiliation is essentially what amounts to an individual who's always like joining a group, wants to join a group. Need for power has to do with an individual who just needs that lifting up. Need for affiliation, need for power have the same thing in common, in the sense that it's my motivation with respect to how other people treat me. Affiliation, they let me join them. Power, they lift me up. Now, to get more clarity on that, if you compare that to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is another very, very familiar model, we notice that need for achievement corresponds to need for self-actualization or self-actualization needs. It is the same thing we're looking at. When you see two different theorists describe it in somewhat different ways, and you tell yourself, no, that's the same thing, but from two different points of view, pull them together and you get a lot more of a dynamic understanding of what the thing is. So need for achievement corresponds to need for self-actualization. need for esteem in Maslow's model is need for power in McClelland's model. Need for esteem sounds cool, need for power sounds bad, but it's the same thing. And then need for affiliation in McClelland's model is need for belongingness in Maslow's model. So you put them together and you can kind of see how they fit. Now, with that said, there was this question, since McClelland's model was extremely popular, it was very well taken, and it's highly valid. It has all kinds of applications. A lot of theorists just love it a lot, and then they want to apply it to something. Well, here we had two Carols, actually. Carol Ames actually was the first one, 1992. She published the initial study on goal orientation theory. All she wanted to do was take McClelland's theory and say, hey, what does it look like when we measure this in students in the classroom? How do they behave? Can we pick out who's the need for achievement, need for affiliation, need for power? Carol Ames found originally it collapses into just two different ways of being a student. It's a limited environment being a student, right? It's not everything. It's just student stuff. It turns out that need for achievement does manifest itself in the educational environment, and it looks like a need for mastery. In the early literature, I think they call that learning orientation as opposed to mastery orientation. I think Dweck calls it mastery orientation. It means the same thing, though. Just you got to decide whether the word works or not. And the other orientation that they found was need for power, need for affiliation, both collapsing into performance orientation. In other words, an orientation on whatever it takes, I need to demonstrate performance. Whether it's true or not, I need to demonstrate it. Where the learning orientation or the mastery orientation is, it's like, I don't really care about what it looks like about learning. I'm just diving in and eating this stuff up. And that's interesting because it's the entrepreneurial mentality thrown into the educational setting. You also find this, though, and this goes beyond, among a lot of the need for affiliation types in the learning environment, need for affiliation doesn't always look like performance orientation. It'll split. There will be some need for affiliation types who become mastery oriented. Others will still split off and become performance oriented. So it's kind of like in that little microcosm of the universe where everybody's just in a classroom, learning in a library someplace. The need for affiliation types who out in society would just want to be accepted, in the learning environment, they can actually be more, you might say, entrepreneurial in how they behave. Anyway, so I explain it this way. I say goal orientation theory is a way to adapt McClelland's theory of manifest needs to the domain of learning. In this context, the need for power and the need for affiliation collapse together in their net effect to appear similar, and we call that performance orientation, as I said. A fixation on the appearance of performance. Either they really try to perform because they have no choice, or they find some other way to make it look like they performed. So you get some cheating and some sneakery in that, as well as some people thinking I have no choice. I gotta bear down and get good at the stuff, otherwise I'll lose. So you get that mixture. The need for achievement differs as mastery orientation or learning orientation, we call it in some of the literature, as a fixation on the experiential or learning value of the activity. Later on, we're going to find that what Burke did in his research was, it turns out that you can adapt this model, adapt McClelland's model to group climate, the idea of climate. Or Burke will say, organizational culture, that's at the level of the organization. Climate is always at a more localized level, kind of a group or department sort of level, right? It's a group. It might be a department, but I mean, it's kind of everybody in the same room sort of idea. Everybody in the same unit sort of idea, unit level. And at the climate level, when you want to influence climate, you can actually manipulate. You can decide to, let's say, train a leader to engage in power-oriented or need for power types of behavior that encourage a need for power among the employees, or that encourage a need for affiliation, or that encourage a need for achievement. Now, actually, McClelland's original research showed he was doing that just as part of his experimentation. So Burke and Lippmann naturally saw, yeah, you can do that in real life too. In fact, McClelland also was experimenting with it between the 61 and 1970, doing some consulting. So anyway, you can get people in the unit to take on a different set of attitudes. They're more achievement-oriented, they're more power-oriented, they're more affiliation-oriented, depending on what you want to do at the unit level. And that turned out to have an impact on performance in various ways in organizations. So, with that said, let us take one more break and then move into the team project. I'll be going over that little handout that I gave you. Continue on in team project. So the team project is a process diagnosis with recommendations for improvement and a stage-by-stage preview for implementation. In your initial team meetings, in week 2, you'll review candidate processes. That means each member of the team will say, okay, look, I work at this organization. Here's a process that I would consider changing. And you're going to pick one of these. So for possible improvement based on team members' actual experience in their respective organizational roles. By week 3, you'll have selected a process to serve as the team's focus throughout the remainder of the term. I know it takes a while. Got to create the team. Eventually, you got a process, and then you don't quite have 9 weeks left to do it. You have only a few weeks left to do your thing, but that'll be enough. It'd be great if you had a long time to develop as teams, but we can't do that. So thereafter, the team member whose organization houses the featured process will act as the organizational insider and subject matter expert, naturally, while other members will serve as consultants. Now that means, by the way, with an insider, with somebody who's like, yeah, this is my organization, it's our team, over time there are questions that pop up, well, what about this, what about that? Say, well, actually, we got this going on, we got that going on. And so there'll be a lot of richness in what's available about the process. It won't be anything kind of make work, lean, like a process coming out of nowhere kind of thing. It'll be deeply embedded in the organizational structure, which should become visible in the write-ups. And then I say down here, the essay must evidence first-hand experience from a real organization as represented by a team member. And I think with teams, we're not going to have too much trouble with this, but I say here, teams must refrain from seeking to substitute fictional accounts for valid experience. Can't just say, well, let's just make up some. Let's pretend like what you'll find is that the richness is not there. There's no way to bring in all of the unexpected stuff that happens in an organization regarding how to deal with or how to improve a particular kind of process. Drawn from generic literature to discuss high-profile organizations. So here's a preview of team activities, how we'll do this. Week 1 is guidance on team composition, structure, and expectations. That's essentially this. You read this thing, and you understand what's coming, right? But also, you're filling out the PLSI, and the PLSI is going to be my basis for organizing teams. The PLSI is not a personality test. It's MBTI, by the way, is the formal, expensive, published version of the same thing. Same animal, only the original was MBTI. The PLSI measures the same stuff. Now, the PLSI gives you like an INTP or ENTJ, these kinds of things. In the profile, the last letter, the J or the P, which doesn't mean being judgmental or anything like that. If you're a J, you spend more time on the T or the F, whichever one you are, than you do on the S or the N, whichever one you are. If you're a P, you spend more time on the S or N. It's a focal point, but it has a big impact on your tendency to do what you're planning. What we want, ideally, as much as possible, so everybody on the team is either a J or a P. We don't want to mix them. There'll be some mixture here and there, but we try to avoid it. But otherwise, that's the most important thing. Why is that? Because all the J's are actually people who are similarly impatient to, all right, stop talking and get to work. All the P's are people who are similarly patient to keep on talking. So they'll be under the same pressure. You're not going to have like some J's on a team with P's saying, well, we're going to do the work, and the P's are kind of be left behind. So we want to try to make people as compatible as possible. And the compatibility in the PLSI or MBTI actually has to do with information processing, implying your communication and, let's say, your interactiveness, not your personality. The only personality component in there is actually the first one. It happens to correspond also to the 5-factor personality model. That's introversion, extroversion. And that's the second most important ingredient. So the first one is the P versus J, and the next one is the extroversion, introversion, and then after that it's the other two, and A little complicated after that, but that's how I do it. So when you get together in your team, what you're going to be expecting is you're all going to be virtual teams. Virtual teams are tough because you got to like find ways to communicate. You got to try to insist on communicating. You want to try to set up a structure at the minimum where you have a meeting, you get together at a meeting. If you can possibly do a synchronous meeting, obviously it's better. If you can't always do it, you might have to split it in two. Somebody's on the other side of the world or something. You got to deal with these kinds of things. But the tricky part of virtual teams is that you feel like you can just disconnect and float away. And when you talk to people, you don't feel necessarily like there's a strong connection. So there's got to be a lot of push, a lot of effort at the activity, the energy of interaction. What that usually means in practice, if you do it right and if you can think it through, is you find other ways to communicate with some team members. The ideal structure of a team would be this. In between meetings, everybody finds some excuse to talk with each other team member one at a time in various ways by some other method. It's hardly ever happens because it's really hard to manage this sort of thing. But if you could just say, hey, just checking in, just, hey, touching bases, how you doing, whatever, it's better than not. So you want people to be talking to each other. So at the very least, with regard to meetings, let's assume that you're able to put together, we have a meeting every week. Okay, that's minimum. Got to at least have a meeting every week, otherwise it's not going to work. And then in between the meetings, every individual is doing something that's going to support the next meeting. Like, okay, I agree to do this, I agree to do that, I'm waiting for the copy to get to me so I can proofread it, or whatever my role is. You're doing something in between the meetings. We'll give you more guidance on that later, but that's essentially there's a challenge in the teams, obviously. But the good thing is that you don't have to write any individual essays in this class. It's only the team essay. So for those of you who feel like you're leaning back too much, remember, communicating more creates more presence, and that can solve the problem of, oops, I got low peer reviews. Communicate more, talk more with people, including one-on-one interactions. So very powerful. All right, so team formation then is week 2. You're going to drop a team charter. Team charters have a big impact, based on actual research, on the team's ability to hold together and actually follow through with all the stuff that they came up with. Lack of a team charter creates a looseness and a ghostliness that often invites, especially a virtual team, just kind of drift apart. And pretty soon a week goes by and say, oh, darn, I forgot the team meetings today. I was la-la land somewhere. So in the team charter, you'll decide on the team structure, described here as roles, norms, goals, and strategies. The essential part of a team structure is the roles and norms. Roles, what distinguishes everybody from everybody else on the team? The better you can do that, the better you're going to protect yourself against free riders. Can't have two people have the same role. People have the distinct roles. And some of those roles are going to be like, okay, my role is proofreader, so I'm waiting for the copy to get to me. So you got timing issues, right? You got to, okay, get it to Joe. Joe's going to proofread now. Okay, And then Fred's going to do review for APA style, and Amy's going to review for source facticity. There's lots of things you can review for. Norms are what everybody has in common on a team. And in the team charter, to the best that you can, you decide on your roles and norms up front. Even though in real team evolution, there's going to be some pushing and pulling on these things that'll have an influence on what actually emerges, because the emergent structure of a team is a real thing too. Goals, that's the outcome that you're after, which is fairly simple in a manner of speaking, but it's kind of like, what are you after? Well, we're going to finish the project. So finish the project in what way, right? It's like, how do you want that project to look? What do you want it to be? Is everybody worried about efficiency? Is everybody worried about impact? Anyway, so strategies then has to do with the operating objective. You're going to decide what principles you want to follow as best you can. Again, it's the initial meeting. You don't know quite what the pressures are going to do to you over the next few weeks, but as best you can, you're going to try to figure out what qualities do we want to emphasize in our work. Do we want to emphasize thoroughness? I would like, we're all really busy, let's just get the thing done and be as efficient as possible. What is our operating objective going to be? And the research shows that if you can clearly define the outcomes, the goals, and your strategies or the approaches that you take up front, you'll do a better job as a team. And it's a challenge, but I'll give you some ideas in the next bit of information. So summarize each team member's current organization and professional role. So you want to put that down. We know what they are and what the role is. There you have the basis for understanding what that one process is going to be that you're going to pick. Begin discussions on which team member's organization will serve as the focus of analysis throughout the course. Discuss possible processes to analyze. And a process, of course, as I said, and I'll repeat this in writing a bit later, but it is a trigger. The process starts. There are these steps. A process on paper looks like a description of first do this, then do this, then do this other thing over here, and use these materials and so forth until you're done. So it's always a sequence of steps. So identify the process. This is week 3 now. Process definition. You're going to identify the process selected for analysis. Describe the process as a sequence of value-adding activities in a logical chain. There are going to be at least half a dozen value-adding activities. It can't be like read a book, write a summary. Oh, that's called a summary writing process. Now there's got to be divided up further. So there's going to be at least 6 steps. Once you can describe the process and you stick it in as a prompt into a particular AI routine, it should give you a nice little line and box chart that shows you the process in writing. Then you take that and you stick it in the paper as the illustration of the process that you're describing. So identify the process contribution to the organization. It's going to require some judgment. What does it add to the organization? Oh, let's see. Without the process, this would happen. Okay. Describe how to assess the process's added value. How much value does it provide? Describe the difference in effectiveness desired from improvement. So there's a lot of stuff. It's going to be all about the process in week 3. And one of the points that I want to make in week 3 is that you're all into a process. Most of the time when we change an organization, we're changing a process, we're changing several processes. We don't usually come in with grandiose, giant change initiatives going on. It's usually at the process level. Now, strictly speaking, process change is a type of incremental change. It is not discontinuous. Nevertheless, when you understand change at the process level, then you can more easily expand to larger levels where essentially you have systems of processes. Those need changing. The processes within them need changing. Sometimes you're discarding processes, introducing new ones. Now you're talking at a higher level of complexity. So we have a question. You want to write it or you want to speak it?
I have a lot of changes going on in my organization at the time. Is there like a level of difficulty or a timeline for change that is recommended for this project?
You're going to end up with some recommendations. You're not going to be able to. I don't expect anybody to be able to make the actual change and implement it, if that's what you mean. Are you saying that you might consider within your own organization to maybe take one of these processes and try to make that a candidate for improvement?
Possibly.
Yeah, that would be an idea.
Yes. I just didn't know if, like, for instance, we are changing email platforms, which is a pretty massive change. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's a good example.
No, yeah, I see what you're saying. It's like the level of complexity. So that could be the process. You might say, well, that's a process with some processes embedded within it. Well, that's fine. You can still do it. The point was to take a process, or I guess you could construe it as a process system. When we're changing platforms, I know there's a lot that goes on, but to me, it's just a big process. It's still a process. You could even argue that even in a small process, let's pretend it's an assembly line process, right? Stuff comes this way, you do something, and stuff goes that way, and you have to assign jobs for each person or whatever. That within the process, there's a lot of feed-in. Other processes are already feeding in, even in something simple like an assembly line. So processes tend to stem from other processes anyway. So if you're dealing with a big process like a changing platform, which I think is a good candidate, it's a really good topic for this kind of analysis, you will always have some extra processes implicit, especially the training processes that go on. They have to, then they'll be trained doing this. Well, that process, that's a training process out there that you give a label to, but you never had a chance to describe completely because it requires its own ball of wax, as it were. So I wouldn't worry about that being too high a level of complexity. Changing a platform is easy to understand. Going into an organization and say we're going to change the strategy is harder to understand. That's a process too, but it's an enormous one. If it's strategy change, you know what I'm saying? So when I think of have high-scale processes, I'm thinking more of like strategic change, and anything that's transformational in nature. But if you're changing out platforms, that's still at the transactional level, in my opinion, so it's still very manageable in this context, and I think it would create a really good case study. So, let's see, okay. Are we choosing one of our classmates' experiences? Yes, we are choosing one of our classmates' experiences to improve. Yes, we are. It's only going to be one person, so with a team, you're going to be discussing and figuring out who's got the best idea, as it were, and go in that direction. But that makes sense anyway. You know, most people who study organization development and change learn it from the perspective of we're going to be consultants on some level. If you're consultants, then it's some other organization that is doing the change or that's undergoing the change, but you're outside and you're kind of feeding it. So it makes sense. Have one person as an insider, the other people as outsiders. It's perfect. All right, so let's see, process definition, then you get into the question of identifying the process contribution to the organization. This is where you say, okay, how do you measure it? How do you measure its added value? And remember, sometimes, or the measurement of effectiveness is how many errors come out of it, and then you have to stop and think, what is an error? Maybe we have never thought about that before and then apply it. Or other times it might be something else. But one thing, every process universally has error as one of its outputs. How many times did it fail to meet specifications? It's always something you can do. You can always point out, we're just going to do the error. We're going to try to produce the error. First we're going to define it. Then we're going to figure out what the specs are supposed to be. Then we'll say, okay, it's got to fall within these parameters. And if it doesn't, then then we'll call that, we'll mark that one off. And what we want to do is figure out what the error rate is now, and then decrease that. So that's a good way to go. Unfreezing phase. Then we get, weeks 4, 6, 7 now we get into unfreezing, moving, and freezing. It's a lot to do. It's a short period of time, but it's like, well, it gives you a chance to work through unfreezing, and we're going to apply Cotter's stages 1 through 3. It's going to be slightly a challenge, but I'm going to give you some more tips on this as we go. Cotter's model essentially paints a picture of how to undertake what we normally call transformational change. Just the scale of what he tends to talk about is big. And what we want to be able to do is adapt it to smaller scale stuff without getting so wrapped around the axle. We still want to be able to apply his model in the best possible way. But we don't want to be like saying, well, let's call in top management, to do this. There's a certain awareness necessary, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be a giant change artist comes in and changes the whole place just to improve a training program. So we're going to work through Cotter and then understand Cotter, then not just from the transformational perspective, but kind of more down to earth and more in practical terms. I think that'll help a lot, because otherwise everybody learns Cotter and it's just big and mind-blowing and just something you never think you're going to experience. So we're going to offer response to each activity listed in the Cotter-Levine slide deck, both in the Levine box and the Cotter boxes. We have these boxes. I'm going to have some guidelines. Focus on the broader task of ensuring that all employees are aware of the incipient change initiative and able to contribute their talent to the overall cause. That's the open system aspect of it, by the way. When you undertake an organization change initiative, you want as many people who may be affected by it to be able to pipe in some way, to be a part of it. It's hard because, we can't just take them off the lines and have to stop working all the time. But you want to get as much feed in from all the people as possible. But if you're ever doing anything like the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award or doing a TQM initiative, you're going to find the same thing happens. They want everybody, as much as possible, to take part in the change, because your organization is made out of everybody. It isn't made out of just a few leaders and everybody else is little tools lying around. Everybody is actually a living, breathing part of the organization. Now I say it's not literally the people, it's their behaviors, but still, you want those brains to be active as much as possible. So you'll be exploring ways to do that, to encourage it, to foment that sort of engagement. Let's see, then we go to the moving phase, which is Cotter stages 4 through 6. Offer a response to each activity listed in the Cotter-Levine slide deck again. Specify changes in the steps of the focal process, the supporting processes that interact with the focal process, and cultural adjustments needed to support the new philosophy. The process, that's the focal process, that's what you're looking at, that's the process. Some of the steps are going to change. If you're going to change a process, some of the steps are going to change. Inputs, the training behind it, the criteria, what people are expected to do, some things are going to change. That means that you must have a definition enough in the beginning so that when it changes, you can tell it's changed, instead of saying, well, they don't actually have guidance on this. A lot of times you will have the opportunity, in fact, to look at a process that doesn't even exist It just exists by implication. Like, for example, I'm preparing I'm trying to improve the relevance of a particular, trying to give you the essay structure, as it were. But I have this generic content in there right now, and I'll put a little more stuff about something that looks like an actual process. So I was thinking about one of my own experiences going back in the day, and one of them was I was part of a translation division, and I noticed early on that each individual would translate a book into Spanish. There it is. The supervisor would look at it, Then it would go off to be written up with the graphics and everything. I said, well, what was wrong with that? Well, we were translating military manuals. So what does that mean? Well, there's a whole bunch of standardized terminology in military writing. Each individual is just looking at it as a non-military person. Most of them were non-military. In fact, I think I was the only military person there, military background. And so they're all translating based on their best understanding of what these words mean, but then a particular term ends up getting translated in 3 or 4 different ways in different books. Then there's an instructor in the classroom who's got this book in Spanish and is trying to teach all these Latin American officers this stuff. And it's like, now the words are all different from that other book over there. Like, well, why don't we standardize the terminology? I mean, it's like, well, in the military, in the Army, the terminology is standardized by definition. So, of course, you need some way to do it. So basically, we didn't have a process for that. At best, we had a collection of a whole bunch of previously translated manuals stuffed in a library in the middle, but we weren't using it. So there was a process that could be described that it exists only by implication. It could be like, well, let's see, I'm translating. How did you translate that? Oh, okay, thank you. Did you? Right, informal. So there's a process that doesn't exist but should exist. You can describe it as a process. It's an informal process right now, full of error. What I want to do is formalize it. And that's another way to construe this whole process thing. So there will be steps. And cultural adjustments. Cultural adjustments have to do this sort of thing. Imagine this. You're like, okay, we're going to improve this process. Let's say this process is okay right now. We'll make it better, make it sharper. What's the attitude? What's the operating objective message? So we want people to be thinking in terms of quality, or thinking in terms of how the customer reacts, customer impact, thinking in terms of something new, and try to encourage it, promote it. That's the cultural change. All right, so then we get to the freezing phase. As Cotter stages 7 and 8, offer a response to each activity listed in the slide deck. Focus on preventing defunct process norms from resurfacing. That's the biggest threat. Now, the moving phase, by the way, is the biggest place of failure in a change initiative, because implementation is hard. But I think it's since the freezing phase is what locks everything into place and keeps things from being snapping back. I think when the commentators say implementation doesn't occur correctly, I think what they often mean is that implementation isn't properly followed up by a true institutionalization of the changes. So yeah, maybe implementation is like, here's the new rules, bye, So what happened there? Well, you didn't really implement it, you could argue. Or maybe you did theoretically, but there was no making everybody do it kind of follow-up step. And even if they did start to do it, there was no don't slide back follow-up step. So the biggest problem from the perspective of systems theory, from the perspective of the organization as an open system, is when you make changes in an organization, if you don't really pin down those changes, go do your whack-a-mole across it, find those little parts of the carpet and knock them down because one part influences the other, then people tend to fall back into their old ways. It isn't because they're lazy. It's like the birds in flight. So you tell all those birds in the V formation, get out of that V formation. We don't want that. We want an S formation. You put them in the S formation. What happens? They all go back into the V formation. Never seen it done, but you can assume that's probably the case. They're not going to stay in an S formation. So how come they keep going back to the V formation? We need to do some freezing here. Anyway. We're going to be focused on preventing defunct process. In other words, the old process norms from coming back, the snapping back into the old ways. Remember, you change one part of an organization, all the other parts of the organization are conspiring in all kinds of weird ways without knowing it to push that thing back into its old ways, because that's what fits. So then we're going to apply an ontological model to identify activity zones to investigate across the organization potential interaction with the focal process. The ontological model, which is a 7S model or 6-box model, That's the simplest way to say, all right, okay, let's look at systems. You look throughout the organization, make sure the systems are all updated in a way to support the new process. How about helpful mechanisms in you doing this? So it gives you parts of the organization to go look at, to investigate, to examine, to explore, and then to look for, that's going to affect this process. Let's talk about these people to change this thing. This is going to affect that process. There's going to be maybe how you select people will change things. Select people as employees. A really simple example. Your job description, your job specifications say they must know Microsoft Word, and meanwhile you switch to Apple, and it still says must know Microsoft Word. Obviously that's got to change, but it's the thing you got to look for. We got to change that. Job specifications. Okay, then in week 8, you're going to revise the entire paper based on combined feedback from all weeks. And that'll give you a chance where you can say, what am I supposed to do with this feedback that we got from each week? Say, just wait. Week 8, you'll be able to do it. And as you're moving through the weeks, you should probably take some time. Say, hey, let's start with some of this stuff early. Let's see if we can get some of this feedback in there. And turn in the final project then. So what we're trying to emphasize is critical thinking. So pursuant to the criterion of critical thinking, team members must be expected to scrutinize every detail of any draft of a team project task to ensure its factual quality. And when you use AI can inject fake stuff, fake news, into the fray. And you got to be like looking at, there's something, let me look that up, there's something. So you can imagine with a team, you have the opportunity to catch these things. There's plenty of eyes that can look at something. So we want to take that fully. There can never be a case that we threw it into AI, came back, looked great, everybody said, that's great, thumbs up, let's turn it. Can't be. I've always thought this about teams. I used to teach teams, in fact. Being on a team. It's a big social psychology thing. Teams aren't just groups of people who decide to work together. They take on lives of their own. There's an emergent property of a team that influences the team members. So it's a very big deal. When you're on a team and your work product is, we got to write this stuff. What you don't want to do is just divvy it up among people, cobble it all together and turn it in. That's something I used to see too much. What you want to do in the revision process, here we have the copy, cool, this is a copy, this is in draft form. All right, we read on the order, want to do this. Every team member should have a chance to look at every draft that you're going to turn in and change it somehow. Don't just say, it looks good to me, because in real life you see that as well, and you know what happens. The looks good to me ends up being, I didn't know that was in there. People don't want to deal with it. It's not supposed to be a matter of, he'll feel bad if I say, let me change this. No, this is real life. Open up that document when it's your turn, say, all right, let me change this, that, and this. And maybe you have a way of saying, I changed these parts. Maybe you use track changes, I don't know, whatever works to indicate if there needs to be feedback on what you changed, but you need to be able to establish you changed something. If everybody changes something, then at least there's the potential for some energy on the document, and there's less likelihood of skipping over something. Factual quality, alignment with team members' genuine deliberation on the concept at hand, of course, right? It has to fit the process. It has to have the richness in there. And adherence to the detailed specification of composition expressed in the syllabus. The syllabus has more information in there. Let's say you decide, hey, I wrote up some stuff here. You throw it into ChatGPT or something and say, hey, make it look academic. And it does its usual thing of a whole bunch of little multi-source citations and parentheses and all kinds of garbage. And that looks really great. Let me turn that in. So no, it's a whole bunch of AI artifacts you have there. Some are AI hallucinations when it gives you fake sources, but also the artifactual nature of the fact that the multi-source citations stuck in wrong places. There's a lot of AI stuff that occurs. If you look at it and say, that's not how we would write this. I'm not talking about the grammar. Don't worry about the grammar too much. Just the artifacts. When it throws in citations and semicolons and dashes and things that you don't normally use, say, wait a minute, I would do it. Let me change it back. And your Microsoft Word will tell you when you change it if there's a squiggly under it, you did something wrong. So if it accepts it, accept it. But take it back to your normal mode. It's got to be human when you turn it in. So see, suppression of critical thinking in a team damages the reasoning score associated with the respective team project submission. As the most egregious form of such suppression, the retention of AI hallucinations in any work results in extreme point deduction. Well, AI hallucinations are, there's stuff that completely fake, and it popped up in your paper and you didn't catch it. It's a hallucination. You don't want to be doing that out there in real life. Oh, I went to AI and did this, you know. You heard about the lawyers writing their briefs and throwing it into AI. It comes back and they turn in with fake sources. They should be disbarred for that. I mean, obviously bad things happen, but that's some serious stuff there. You don't want that to happen in real life. So let's see, peer review then. Team members complete self and peer reviews after each project task as subjective assessments of the relative quality and quantity of each team member's contribution to task completion. These assessments serve as a basis for adjusting team task scores for application to each team member using a simple balancing algorithm. A peer review requires strict confidentiality. Any kind of collusion, for example, agreeing, I've seen teams do this before, and it ruins the team dynamic, really, but they think it helps, so it's backwards. Agreeing a priori to assign identical ratings to one another rather than exercising genuine judgment, of course, is unacceptable. As in any disclosure, discussion, or post hoc modification of peer ratings. Now, what the peer ratings are going to ask you to do, by the way, is do two things. One, give everybody a letter grade. Some of them may have the same letter grade. Try to be honest, objective. But second, then you rank order. One of them has to do with the quality, the other one has to do with the quantity of contribution. Either way, it's going to come out, you know, people are going to be different. If everybody came out the same, it would be like nobody did any applied critical thinking to the peer review process. Like people are afraid of applying their own judgment. Now, peer review is strictly confidential. Everything that you write in the peer review, also in the TMX, little TMX scale that I have right after the peer review that you'll be doing, is strictly confidential because you need to be free to input your honest impressions. And you can't be discussing those in the team. Can't together, hey, let's talk about the peer review and how we're going to make this thing work. So no, you got to let that happen by itself. Same thing for the TMX scale. Okay, then we have general standards. With the benefit of so many different eyes on each project task, one should expect superb work that adheres to strict APA style in the right way, aligns with additional syllabus requirements and form and format, and betrays no detectable reliance on AI. Teams should be ready to strategize to perform at this exacting standard. So I say down here at the bottom, the proper use of AI tools is a standard expectation in this course. I think you should be using them. The thing is, you can't let them use you. So I say AI produces numerous undesirable artifacts. So we want to get really, really good at it. To remove all possible AI anomalies, team members must exercise intense scrutiny over their work products at every stage of development. And so by comparison to the individual essays that you may have written in the past, oh, I got to write an essay on this experience of mine. Oh, it's really hard, really deep. And a lot of times people go way into it. And it takes hours and hours, and it's great, a great thought process. Well, this one here, most of the thinking is going to be as you interact with each other, and you're thinking. And the more you interact, the better your peer review comes. So you want to engage as much as you can. Well, that's social learning that occurs. So you're not missing anything in terms of the potential for critical thinking. But then when each person gets a chance to take a look at that document and say, it's got to look like human beings are behind this, despite the fact that we have machines helping us. We can't come back with anything artificial. That's the point. But with all the people on the team, you should have no problem with that. So it'll be an interesting experience, I think. So with that said, we will call it quits, and then wish you all good luck and see you again online.